Pharmaceutical CEO learns his assistant's daughter is his child and the woman he stupidly let go. Daniel Park stood in his glass-walled corner office, 43 floors above the bustling city, staring at the Chicago skyline as another day of pharmaceutical empire building drew to a close. At 34, he was the youngest CEO in Park Pharmaceutical's history, a fact that should have filled him with pride. Instead, all he felt was the familiar hollow ache that had lived in his chest for the past 9 years. 9 years since he'd made the choice that elevated him to the corner office and condemned him to a lifetime of wondering, what if? 9 years since he'd watched Gabrielle Idris walk away from him, her heels clicking against the marble floor of this very office, carrying his heart with her into a future he'd convinced himself they couldn't share. The memory hit him like a physical blow, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. That last morning, when the scent of her vanilla perfume had lingered in the air, mixing with the leather and ambition that defined his world. She'd stood where his executive chair now sat, tears streaming down her beautiful face, her voice steady despite the heartbreak. "I won't be your secret anymore, Daniel. I won't be the woman you love in the shadows while you marry someone appropriate for the company board." He'd wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she was everything appropriate and more. That her brilliance had saved 3 major deals, that her compassion had humanized his father's cold corporate legacy, that her laugh was the only sound that made his empty penthouse feel like home. Instead, he'd stood silent, his dying father's words echoing in his mind from their final conversation just weeks before, "The company must come first, son." Park Pharmaceuticals needs a leader who understands duty over desire. "Promise me you'll choose the path that secures our legacy." So he'd let her go. Watched her gather her personal items with trembling hands, the small succulent plant she'd nurtured on her desk, the photo of her mother, the lucky pen she'd used to edit all his most important speeches. Each item she packed felt like another piece of his soul being carved away. When she'd paused at the door, looking back one last time with hope flickering in her dark eyes, he'd forced himself to turn toward the window, to show her his back instead of his breaking heart. "Goodbye, Daniel," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of his world crumbling. "I hope the company gives you everything you think you need." But it hadn't. 9 years of unprecedented success, of quarterly profits that made stockholders weep with joy, of pharmaceutical innovations that changed lives across 3 continents, none of it had filled the Gabrielle-shaped void in his life. The board meetings where they praised his vision felt empty without her intelligent insights. The charity galas where he was celebrated as Chicago's most eligible bachelor felt hollow without her warm presence beside him. Even his impending engagement to Maria Deline, beautiful, connected, perfectly polished Maria who represented everything the board wanted in a CEO's wife, felt like putting on an expensive suit that would never quite fit right. The weight of his father's ring, now on his finger as both symbol and shackle of the legacy he'd inherited, seemed heavier today than usual. Tomorrow's board meeting would finalize the merger with Maria's family pharmaceutical company, creating the largest drug development conglomerate on the East Coast. It was brilliant business. It was everything his father had dreamed of. It was absolutely, completely wrong. Daniel loosened his silk tie, a gesture that would have horrified his perfectly controlled public image. In 30 minutes, he had dinner reservations with Maria at the city's most exclusive restaurant, where photographers would capture their romantic evening for the society pages. Next week, their engagement would be announced at the annual Pharmaceutical Industry Charity Gala. 2 months later, their Christmas wedding would be the social event of the season. The thought made his stomach turn. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Mr. Park?" His current assistant, Janet, peered through the doorway with the cautious expression of someone who'd learned to read his moods. "Ralph Woods is here to see you. He says it's urgent." Daniel straightened immediately. Ralph Woods, his father's oldest friend and the man who'd mentored Daniel through his first chaotic years as CEO, didn't make urgent visits without good reason. "Send him in." Ralph entered with the careful movements of a man who'd recently been reminded of his mortality. Last month's mild heart attack had aged him, but his keen blue eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had built half of Chicago's pharmaceutical district. "You look like hell, son," Ralph said without preamble, settling into the leather chair across from Daniel's desk. "Nice to see you too, Ralph. How are you feeling?" "Like a man who's been given a second chance to see clearly." Ralph studied Daniel with uncomfortable intensity. "That's why I'm here. There's something you need to know, something I should have told you years ago." Daniel's pulse quickened. Ralph's tone carried the weight of secrets about to surface. "What is it?" "Your father's last words to me weren't about the company, Daniel. The night before he died, when the morphine cleared and he had a moment of clarity, he grabbed my hand and said something that's haunted me ever since." Ralph's voice grew heavy with regret. "He said, 'Don't let Daniel sacrifice love for duty like I did with Margaret. The company will survive without the perfect wife, but Daniel won't survive without his heart.'" The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Margaret had been his father's first love, the woman he'd given up to marry Daniel's mother in a strategic alliance between pharmaceutical families. It was a story Daniel had never heard but suddenly understood with devastating clarity. "Why didn't you tell me this 9 years ago?" Daniel's voice came out hoarse. "Because I was a coward. Because I believed, like you did, that duty had to come first. Because I watched your father live with 30 years of regret and I was afraid that if you chose differently, you'd blame me for destroying everything he built." Ralph leaned forward, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "But watching you these past 9 years, seeing you succeed brilliantly at everything except being happy, I finally understand what your father was trying to tell me." Daniel felt the foundations of his carefully constructed life shifting beneath him. Everything he'd told himself about his choice, every justification he'd built around letting Gabrielle go, crumbled in the face of this revelation. "There's more," Ralph continued. "There's a place you need to see, a community health clinic that's doing extraordinary work with limited resources. The Riverside Community Health Center. They've requested funding from our community outreach program, and I think you should handle this one personally." "Ralph, I don't think, promise me, Daniel. One visit. See what healing looks like when it's driven by passion instead of profit margins." Ralph's voice carried the weight of a man trying to correct years of silence. Sometimes the most important investments are the ones that don't show up on quarterly reports. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. As Ralph left, his words echoing in the suddenly too quiet office, Daniel found himself staring at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, Gabrielle was living a life he'd never been brave enough to share. Somewhere out there, the path he'd been too afraid to take was still waiting, if he could find the courage to finally choose his heart over his fears. Have you ever discovered that the sacrifice you thought was necessary was actually the very thing that destroyed what you were trying to protect? Sometimes the universe gives us second chances, but only when we're brave enough to admit that our first choice was wrong. For Daniel Park, that moment of truth was about to arrive in the most unexpected way possible. The community health clinic visit would happen tomorrow. He had no idea that it would change everything. Chapter 2. The next morning arrived with the kind of oppressive summer heat that made Chicago feel like it was wrapped in a damp blanket. Daniel Park sat in the back of his black Mercedes, watching the city transform from gleaming corporate towers to neighborhoods where hope and struggle lived side by side. The Riverside Community Health Center was a 40-minute drive from his downtown headquarters, but it might as well have been another world entirely. His dinner with Maria the night before had been a disaster of epic proportions. She'd spent 2 hours discussing wedding venues, guest lists, and the strategic advantages of a Christmas ceremony for tax purposes and media coverage. When he'd remained silent, picking at his $28 salmon, she'd finally asked, "Daniel, are you even listening to me? He'd looked up to find her perfectly sculpted face arranged in an expression of practiced concern, her diamond earrings catching the restaurant's ambient lighting like tiny stars in a carefully constructed constellation. Beautiful, brilliant, completely appropriate Maria, who discussed their marriage like a business merger because that's exactly what it was. "I'm sorry," he'd said, meaning it. "I have a lot on my mind." "The board meeting tomorrow?" "Don't worry, darling. Once the merger is finalized, we'll have everything we've worked for." She'd reached across the table to squeeze his hand, her touch perfectly manicured and completely cold. "We're going to be such a power couple." Now, watching neighborhoods blur past his tinted windows, Daniel wondered when exactly he'd started measuring his life in quarterly reports instead of heartbeats. When had he stopped dreaming about making a difference and started obsessing over making margins? His father's pharmaceutical company had been built on innovation and compassion, developing affordable medications for underserved communities. Somehow, in Daniel's pursuit of success, that mission had gotten buried under layers of profit projections and stockholder expectations. "We're here, Mr. Park," his driver announced, pulling up to a modest brick building that had clearly seen better decades. The sign reading Riverside Community Health Center was cheerful but faded, and the small parking lot was packed with cars that had obviously prioritized reliability over appearances. Daniel straightened his silk tie and checked his reflection in the car window. His charcoal gray suit cost more than most people made in a month, and his Italian leather shoes had never touched anything less pristine than marble floors. He looked exactly like what he was. A wealthy pharmaceutical executive slumming it for a photo opportunity. The thought made him cringe. The moment Daniel stepped through the clinic's front doors, he was hit by a wave of sensory experiences that his sterile corporate world had never prepared him for. The antiseptic smell of medical facilities mixed with coffee brewing somewhere nearby and the faint aroma of someone's homemade lunch. Children's laughter echoed from a corner play area where a small girl with dark curls was helping her mother organize colorful folders. Elderly patients sat in mismatched chairs, sharing stories and advice with the easy intimacy of people who'd learned that community was often the best medicine. But it was the energy of the place that truly staggered him. Despite the worn furniture and outdated equipment, despite the obvious lack of funding and resources, the clinic buzzed with something Daniel's billion-dollar headquarters had never possessed: genuine warmth. Staff members moved through the crowded waiting room with purpose and compassion, addressing patients by name, asking about grandchildren and job interviews and birthday parties. This was what healing looked like when it was driven by passion instead of profit margins. "Mr. Park?" A young receptionist with kind eyes and scrubs decorated with cartoon stethoscopes looked up from her computer. "We're so honored to have you visit us today. I'm Jenny, and I'll be showing you around until our director is free." Director? Daniel had assumed he'd be meeting with a middle management administrator, someone used to schmoozing potential donors. "Oh yes, she's incredible. Gabrielle Idris has transformed this place in the 5 years she's been here. She's with a patient right now, but she should be finished soon." The world tilted sideways. Daniel's carefully controlled composure cracked like glass as the name hit him with the force of a physical blow. Gabrielle. His Gabrielle was here, in this building, probably just down the hall. The woman he'd been mourning for 9 years was close enough that he could potentially hear her voice, see her smile, discover what kind of life she'd built from the ashes of what they destroyed. "Mr. Park? Are you all right?" Jenny's voice seemed to come from very far away. Daniel forced himself to breathe, to maintain the mask of professional interest that had gotten him through countless difficult negotiations. "I'm fine. Just surprised. I didn't realize the director was someone I used to know." "Oh, how wonderful. Ms. Idris is amazing. She came here after finishing her MBA. Did you know she went back to school? She completely revolutionized our patient care protocols and somehow manages to stretch our budget to cover twice as many people as we should be able to serve. Plus, she's the most dedicated single mother I've ever seen. Single mother. The words echoed in Daniel's mind as Jenny led him through the clinic's various departments. Gabrielle had a child. While he'd been building his pharmaceutical empire and planning strategic marriages, she'd been raising a family and transforming a struggling clinic into something extraordinary. The irony was almost too painful to bear. "Here's our pediatric area," Jenny was saying, gesturing toward a bright space filled with child-sized furniture and walls painted with cheerful murals. Ms. Idris designed this herself. She said healing should feel hopeful, especially for children. A burst of musical laughter made Daniel's heart stop completely. He'd know that sound anywhere, it had haunted his dreams for 9 years. But it wasn't Gabrielle's laugh. It was younger, brighter, with the pure joy that only children possessed. He turned toward the sound and felt the universe shift beneath his feet. There, in the corner of the pediatric area, a little girl with dark curls was reading to a group of younger children. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, but she held herself with a confidence that reminded Daniel painfully of someone else. When she looked up from the picture book to check if her audience was paying attention, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Steel gray eyes. His exact steel gray eyes, set in a face that was a perfect blend of his own stubborn features and Gabrielle's elegant bone structure. The child had his grandmother's nose, his father's determined chin, and when she smiled at something one of the younger children said, it was with Gabrielle's warmth but his own rare, crooked grin. "That's Carrie," Jenny said fondly, apparently oblivious to Daniel's internal earthquake. "Ms. Idris's daughter. She practically grew up here in the clinic. Sweetest kid you'll ever meet, and smart as a whip. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up, just like the ones who help people here. Carrie." The child's name was Carrie, and she was reading stories to sick children while her mother ran a clinic that served the community with love and limited resources. Daniel tried to do the math, 9 years since Gabrielle left, and this child appeared to be 8 or 9 years old. The timeline made his chest tight with a possibility so enormous he could barely let himself consider it. "Mr. Park?" A voice like music and memory made him turn, and suddenly there she was. Gabrielle Idris stood in the doorway of the pediatric area, and Daniel's carefully constructed world exploded into a million beautiful pieces. She was more stunning than his memories had dared preserve, confidence and independence radiating from her like warmth, her professional demeanor somehow making her even more attractive than the young assistant he'd fallen in love with years ago. Her dark hair was shorter now, framing her face in a way that emphasized the strength in her features, and when their eyes met across the room, 9 years collapsed into nothing. Time stopped. The busy clinic faded into background noise as they stared at each other across a space that felt simultaneously vast and non-existent. Daniel could see the exact moment recognition hit her. The way her professional smile faltered, the way her hand instinctively went to her throat in a gesture he remembered with devastating clarity, the way her breath caught as if someone had stolen all the oxygen from the room. She was wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes, and sensible flats that suggested long days spent on her feet caring for others. No expensive jewelry, no designer accessories, just the quiet elegance that had always made her stand out in rooms full of people trying too hard to impress. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd found her purpose and fought for it every single day. "Hello, Daniel," she said finally, her voice steady despite the shock he could see in her eyes. "This is unexpected. Gabrielle." Her name came out like a prayer, like something sacred he'd been afraid to say aloud for fear it would disappear. "I had no idea you worked here." I can already feel your hearts racing alongside Daniel's. That moment when the past crashes into the present is something we've all experienced. If this story is speaking to your soul, take a moment to hit that like button and let me know in the comments, have you ever had a reunion that changed everything? Your stories inspire these tales of love rediscovered. Mama. Carrie's voice cut through the tension as she bounded over to Gabrielle with the uninhibited energy of childhood. "Are you done with your patient?" Mrs. Rodriguez was asking if you could look at her grandson's rash again before she leaves. Up close, the resemblance was even more undeniable. Carrie had Daniel's eyes, his stubborn chin, his grandmother's elegant nose. But she moved with Gabrielle's grace and spoke with the kind of compassionate awareness that suggested she'd inherited the best of both parents. When she looked up at Daniel with curious intelligence, he felt something fundamental shift in his chest. "Oh, hello," Carrie said politely, extending a small hand with the formal courtesy that children use when meeting adults. "I'm Carrie Idris. Are you the man who might help our clinic get new equipment?" Daniel stared down at the small hand extended toward his, overwhelmed by the urge to scoop this child up and never let her go. She had his eyes but Gabrielle's warmth, his determination but her compassion. She was everything he'd never known he'd been missing, everything that could have been if he'd been brave enough to choose love over duty 9 years ago. "I'm Daniel Park," he managed, shaking her small hand with a gentleness that surprised him. "And yes, I'm here to learn about the clinic's needs." "Excellent." Carrie beamed at him with a smile that was pure sunshine. "Mama's the best director ever. She makes sure everyone gets the help they need, even when we don't have enough money or supplies. She says healing isn't about having fancy things, it's about caring enough to find solutions." Over Carrie's head, Daniel's eyes met Gabrielle's, and the weight of 9 years of unspoken words settled between them. Here was the life she'd built without him, meaningful work, a beautiful daughter, a community that clearly adored them both. Here was everything he'd walked away from, transformed into something even more precious than what they'd originally shared. "Carrie, sweetheart," Gabrielle said softly, her voice carefully controlled, "why don't you go help Mrs. Rodriguez while I show Mr. Park around the clinic?" "Okay, Mama. Nice meeting you, Mr. Park." Carrie skipped away with the boundless energy of childhood, leaving Daniel and Gabrielle alone with the weight of their shared history and the child who connected them in ways neither had fully acknowledged. "She's beautiful," Daniel said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "She's everything to me," Gabrielle replied, and the fierce protectiveness in her voice made something twist painfully in Daniel's chest. Here was a woman who'd learned to fight for what mattered most, while he'd spent 9 years in boardrooms fighting for things that ultimately meant nothing at all. As Jenny continued the clinic tour, Daniel found himself stealing glances at both Gabrielle and the child who might, the child who could possibly, the child whose very existence suggested that his biggest regret might have consequences he'd never imagined. The professional part of his brain tried to focus on budget projections and equipment needs, but his heart was doing dangerous mathematics involving timelines and gray eyes, and the way Carrie's laugh sounded hauntingly familiar. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. He'd come here to make a routine donation and discover what healing looked like when driven by passion. Instead, he'd found the woman he'd never stopped loving and a child who just might be the family he'd never known he'd lost. The question now was what he planned to do about it. Chapter 3. The rest of Daniel's clinic tour passed in a surreal haze of medical equipment assessments and budget discussions, while his mind reeled with the implications of what he'd discovered. Every time Gabrielle spoke about patient care protocols or funding challenges, he found himself studying her face, searching for signs of the woman he'd once known beneath this confident, accomplished director. And every time Carrie appeared, helping elderly patients to their seats, organizing children's activities, chattering with the easy wisdom of a child raised in a place of healing, Daniel felt his carefully constructed world shift a little more off its axis. By late afternoon, the summer heat had become oppressive, and storm clouds were gathering on the horizon with the ominous weight of Chicago's notorious thunderstorms. The clinic's air conditioning wheezed valiantly against the humidity, but even inside, the atmosphere felt charged with more than just approaching weather. "The pharmacy upgrade would allow us to serve 3 times as many patients," Gabrielle was saying, her professional demeanor firmly in place as they stood in the cramped medication storage room. But Daniel caught the way her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a file, the way she avoided looking directly at him when they were alone. 9 years hadn't erased the awareness that had always sparked between them, if anything, time and distance had made it more electric, more dangerous. The cost projections seem reasonable, Daniel replied, though he'd barely glanced at the numbers. He was too busy fighting the urge to reach out and touch her face, to see if her skin was still as soft as his memories insisted. Park Pharmaceuticals can certainly cover the expansion. Gabrielle finally looked at him directly, and the intensity in her dark eyes made his breath catch. Just like that? No committees, no lengthy approval processes? I'm the CEO, Gabrielle. Sometimes that position has its advantages. The use of her first name hung in the air between them like a confession. For a moment, her professional mask slipped, and he caught a glimpse of vulnerability that made his chest ache with familiar longing. Mr. Park, she said carefully, rebuilding her walls even as he watched. I appreciate Park Pharmaceutical's generosity, but I need to know this decision is based on the clinic's merits, not personal considerations. Before Daniel could respond, the lights flickered ominously overhead, and the first rumble of thunder shook the building's windows. Through the small storage room window, they could see the sky had turned an alarming shade of green-black, and rain was beginning to pelt the glass with increasing intensity. Mama! Carrie's voice echoed from the main waiting area, followed by the sound of running feet. She appeared in the doorway with Jenny close behind, both looking concerned. The weather alert says we might have tornadoes. Mrs. Chen says all the buses have stopped running. Jenny nodded apologetically. We're implementing emergency protocols. All patients and staff need to stay until the storm passes. The weather service is predicting flash flooding in low-lying areas. As if summoned by her words, the rain intensified from a downpour to what sounded like a waterfall hitting the roof. The lights flickered again, more persistently this time, and somewhere in the building, Daniel could hear the clinic's aging electrical system groaning under the strain. How long do these storms typically last? Daniel asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Chicago's summer storms were notorious for their intensity and duration. Could be hours, Gabrielle replied, her director's training taking over as she began mentally cataloging emergency procedures. Jenny, make sure all the patients are comfortable in the main waiting area. Move anyone from the east wing, those windows aren't as secure. I'll check the medical supplies and backup power systems. I'll help, Daniel said automatically, loosening his expensive tie. The offer surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Gabrielle. You don't need to, I want to help, he said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice made her pause. Please. For a moment, they simply looked at each other while thunder crashed overhead and rain drummed against the windows with increasing fury. Then Gabrielle nodded, and Daniel felt something ease in his chest. The first step toward rebuilding a bridge he'd burned 9 years ago. As the storm intensified, the clinic transformed into an impromptu community shelter. Patients who'd been trying to leave found themselves stranded, elderly visitors settled in for the duration, and staff members worked together to make everyone as comfortable as possible. Daniel found himself genuinely useful for the first time in years. His height made him perfect for reaching high shelves, his corporate problem-solving skills translated surprisingly well to emergency logistics, and his expensive suit jacket proved excellent for covering medical supplies that needed protection from potential water damage. Mr. Park, could you help me move these files to higher ground? Gabrielle called from the records office, where a small leak had developed in one corner. If the roof situation gets worse, we can't afford to lose patient records. Daniel appeared beside her immediately, and together they began transferring boxes of files to metal shelving units away from potential water damage. In the cramped space, they were forced to work in close proximity, their bodies brushing with each movement. The familiar scent of her perfume, still vanilla, still warm, still capable of making his pulse race, mixed with the smell of rain and the ozone charge that filled the air before lightning strikes. You didn't have to stay, Gabrielle said quietly as they worked, her voice barely audible over the storm's fury. Your driver could have taken you back to the city before the worst hit.
And leave you to handle an emergency alone? Daniel's response was immediate and fierce. Never.
The intensity of his reply made her look up sharply, and suddenly they were standing too close, sharing air in the small space while lightning illuminated the room in stark, dramatic flashes. Rain pounded the windows like desperate fingers seeking entrance, and the building's old bones creaked and settled around them. "Daniel," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like coming home. "I know," he replied, though neither of them had actually said what they were thinking. The awareness that had always existed between them was crackling to life again, fed by proximity and shared purpose and the electric charge of the storm surrounding them. They were reaching for the same box when the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness broken only by the intermittent flashes of lightning. Gabrielle gasped softly, and Daniel's hand found hers in the darkness, steadying her as thunder shook the building's very foundations. "Emergency lighting should kick in any second," she said, but her voice was breathless, and she didn't pull her hand away from his. When the backup lights finally flickered on, casting everything in an intimate amber glow, they were standing close enough that Daniel could count her eyelashes, close enough that he could feel the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. Her hand was still in his, warm and real and exactly as he remembered, and when she looked up at him with wide, vulnerable eyes, 9 years collapsed into nothing. "This is exactly how it started before," she whispered, and he knew she was remembering their first time together, another storm, another moment when they'd been trapped alone while the world raged around them. "Gabrielle," he said her name like a prayer, like something sacred he'd been afraid to speak aloud. His free hand rose to trace her cheek, and she leaned into the touch despite every rational thought telling her not to. "We can't," she breathed, even as her body swayed toward his. "Too much has changed. Too much has happened." "Has it?" Daniel's thumb brushed across her lower lip, and she shivered despite the warm air. "Because right now, it feels like nothing's changed at all." The storm chose that moment to unleash its full fury. Lightning struck somewhere close by, close enough that the thunder was immediate and deafening, close enough that the building's lights flickered and died again. In the darkness, with rain hammering the windows and wind howling around the clinic's walls, Daniel and Gabrielle found themselves pressed together by circumstances and desire and 9 years of unfinished business. "Mama? Mr. Park?" Carrie's voice echoed from the main area, followed by the beam of a flashlight. "Are you okay back there? Jenny says we should all stay together until the lights come back on." The spell shattered. Daniel and Gabrielle sprang apart like guilty teenagers, both breathing hard, both achingly aware of what had almost happened. In the flashlight's glow, Carrie appeared in the doorway, looking concerned but unaware of the charged atmosphere she'd interrupted. "We're fine, sweetheart," Gabrielle managed, her voice only slightly unsteady. "Just securing some files. We'll be right there." "Okay." Jenny made hot chocolate on the camping stove, and Mrs. Rodriguez brought cookies from home. "It's like a really cool sleepover." Carrie bounced away with the resilience of childhood, leaving Daniel and Gabrielle alone with the weight of what they'd almost done. "We should go," Gabrielle said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "The others will be worried." "Gabrielle, wait." Daniel's voice stopped her at the doorway. "We need to talk. Really talk. About what happened 9 years ago, about what's happening now, about Carrie?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and Daniel's sharp intake of breath told her he'd caught the implication. For a long moment, they stared at each other in the amber emergency lighting while thunder crashed overhead and rain pounded the windows like fate demanding entrance. The question hung between them, loaded with 9 years of secrets and possibilities and consequences neither of them had been brave enough to face. "Yes," Daniel said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "About Carrie." But before either of them could say another word, Jenny's voice echoed through the clinic, "Everyone to the main area, please. The weather service is reporting possible tornado activity in our vicinity. We need to implement severe weather protocols immediately." The moment shattered, replaced by the immediate urgency of keeping everyone safe. But as they hurried toward the main waiting area, Gabrielle's hand briefly touched Daniel's arm, and in that simple contact, he felt a promise that the conversation they'd started would be finished. The storm outside was nothing compared to the emotional tempest brewing between them, and Daniel knew that when this night was over, nothing would ever be the same again. In the main waiting area, patients and staff had gathered together, sharing stories and comfort while the storm raged outside. Carrie was curled up in a chair nearby, reading quietly by flashlight, her presence a constant reminder of the questions that needed answers and the family Daniel was only beginning to understand he might have lost. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Daniel found himself genuinely hoping it would last all night. Because somewhere between moving medical supplies and almost kissing the woman he'd never stopped loving, he'd realized that he wasn't ready to leave this warm, genuine place and return to his cold, empty corporate world. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Chapter 4. The storm raged for 3 more hours, and in that time, Daniel Park discovered something that 9 years of corporate success had never taught him, what it felt like to be genuinely needed. Not for his signature on a check or his approval on a merger, but for his hands and his heart and his willingness to show up when it mattered most. When the emergency lighting finally stabilized and the worst of the weather passed, the clinic felt different. Patients who'd been strangers were now sharing phone numbers and promising to check on each other. Staff members who'd worked together for years had discovered new depths of teamwork and resilience. And Daniel, who'd arrived that morning as a wealthy donor making a courtesy visit, had somehow become part of something real and meaningful. "Mr. Park," called Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who'd been trapped at the clinic when the storm hit, "could you help me to the phone? I need to call my daughter and let her know I'm safe." "Of course," Daniel replied, offering his arm for support. As they walked slowly toward the reception desk, she patted his hand with the easy affection of someone who decided he was worth trusting. "You're a good man," she said simply. "Gabrielle was right about you." "What did she say?" Daniel couldn't help asking, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled with the knowing look of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize love when she saw it. "She said you were the kind of man who would stay when staying was hard." She was right. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Even now, even after 9 years of silence and separation, Gabrielle still believed in the man he'd once been. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. By the time the all-clear was given and patients began arranging rides home, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Daniel should have called his driver hours ago, should have been back in his penthouse reviewing reports and preparing for tomorrow's board meeting. Instead, he found himself helping to stack chairs and check that all the medical equipment had weathered the storm safely. "You don't have to do that," Gabrielle said softly, appearing beside him as he tested the backup power systems. "You've done more than enough already." "I want to help," Daniel replied, echoing his earlier words. "Besides, someone needs to make sure everything's working properly before you're here alone with Carrie." The casual mention of her daughter's name made Gabrielle's breath catch. Throughout the evening, she'd watched Daniel interact with Carrie. Helping her organize games for the younger children, listening seriously to her explanations about the clinic's operations, treating her with the kind of gentle respect that suggested he understood children were people worth knowing. The sight had done dangerous things to her heart. "She likes you," Gabrielle said quietly, watching as Carrie helped Jenny clean up the impromptu storm shelter they'd created in the waiting area. "She's remarkable," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "Bright, compassionate, completely fearless." "She reminds me of who?" Gabrielle asked when he stopped abruptly. "Of you," Daniel said simply. "She has your heart, your way of seeing the best in people. Your courage." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say yet, was that Carrie also had his eyes, his stubborn chin, his grandmother's nose. That watching her move through the clinic with easy confidence had felt like seeing a ghost of his own childhood,
if he'd been lucky enough to grow up in a place filled with love and purpose instead of corporate expectations and emotional distance. Daniel, Gabrielle began, then stopped, as if she'd been about to say something important but lost her nerve. What is it? Nothing. Just, thank you. For staying. For helping. It means more than you know.
Before Daniel could respond, Carrie bounded over with the energy of a child who'd found the storm adventure exciting rather than frightening. Mama, can Mr. Park come to dinner tomorrow? I want to show him my science project about pharmaceutical chemistry. I've been studying how medicines work. The innocent request hung in the air between them like a bridge neither adult was quite ready to cross. Daniel found himself holding his breath, waiting for Gabrielle's response, while she struggled with the implications of letting him deeper into their carefully constructed life. Sweetheart, Gabrielle said gently, Mr. Park is very busy. He has important meetings and, actually, Daniel interrupted, his voice rougher than he intended, I'd love to see your science project, Carrie. If your mother doesn't mind, that is. Carrie looked between them with the sharp intelligence of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions, then focused on her mother with the determined expression Daniel recognized as his own. Please, Mama. He could help me understand the really hard parts about molecular structures. Gabrielle looked into her daughter's hopeful face, then at Daniel, whose steel-gray eyes reflected the same hope with devastating intensity. The smart thing would be to say no, to maintain the boundaries that had kept her heart safe for 9 years. But watching him tonight, seeing him gentle with patience, patient with elderly Mrs. Rodriguez, genuinely interested in Carrie's endless questions, had cracked something open in her chest that she'd thought was permanently sealed. Dinner tomorrow, she said finally. 6 o'clock. Nothing fancy. Nothing fancy, Daniel agreed, but his smile was radiant with relief and something deeper that made Gabrielle's pulse skip. I'll be there. The next evening, Daniel stood outside Gabrielle's modest apartment building, holding a bag of groceries and fighting the most intense case of nerves he'd experienced since his first board presentation. He'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, the most casual outfit he'd worn in years. His hands were actually shaking as he rang the doorbell. Mr. Park. Carrie opened the door with a grin that lit up her entire face. Come see my project. I set it up on the kitchen table so we can look at it while Mama cooks. Daniel followed her into the apartment, and immediately understood why Gabrielle had said, nothing fancy. The space was small but warm, filled with plants and books and photographs that spoke of a life lived with intention rather than excess. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator, and the living room showed signs of being equally suited for homework sessions and movie nights. This is beautiful, Daniel said, meaning it. After years in his sterile penthouse, the apartment's warmth and personality felt like coming home. Mama says a house should feel like a hug, Carrie announced, leading him to the kitchen where her science project was spread across the table. Look. I'm studying how aspirin works in your body, and I have diagrams of molecular structures and everything. For the next hour, Daniel found himself completely absorbed in helping Carrie understand complex pharmaceutical concepts, breaking them down into terms an 8-year-old could grasp while being amazed by her intuitive understanding of scientific principles. Her questions were thoughtful, her curiosity genuine, and her enthusiasm infectious. So the medicine travels through your bloodstream like tiny workers going to fix what's broken? Carrie asked, her brow furrowed in concentration. Exactly. Daniel said, impressed by her grasp of the concept. And different medicines are like different types of workers, some fix pain, some fight infections, some help your heart work better. Like Mama's work at the clinic. She helps people get the right medicine workers for their problems. Just like that, Daniel agreed, catching Gabrielle's eye over Carrie's head. She was standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled incredible, and when she smiled at him, it was with the same warmth she'd shown him 9 years ago, before duty and fear had torn them apart. Dinner's ready, Gabrielle announced, and they moved to the small dining table where she'd set out a simple but perfect meal. Homemade soup, fresh bread, and a salad that had clearly been prepared with love rather than obligation. As they ate, Daniel found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't in years. Carrie chattered about school and friends and her dreams of becoming a doctor, while Gabrielle shared stories about the clinic and her ongoing efforts to expand their services. The conversation was easy, natural, filled with the kind of comfortable intimacy that Daniel had forgotten was possible. "Mama," Carrie said suddenly, "can I ask Mr. Park something personal?" "Carrie," Gabrielle warned, but Daniel nodded encouragingly. "It's okay. What would you like to know? Are you lonely?" Carrie asked with the devastating directness of childhood. "In your big fancy office, I mean. It seems like it would be lonely being in charge of everything all by yourself." Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Out of the mouths of babes. Sometimes," he admitted, his voice quiet. "Being in charge can be lonely, especially when you realize you've been making decisions based on what you thought you should want instead of what actually makes you happy." "What actually makes you happy?" Carrie pressed, leaning forward with genuine interest. Daniel looked across the table at Gabrielle, whose dark eyes were wide with something that might have been hope. "This," he said simply. "Being here with you and your mother. Feeling like I'm part of something real." The admission hung in the air between them, loaded with 9 years of regret and the possibility of something new. Gabrielle's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and Daniel noticed the gesture with the same intensity he'd once brought to reading quarterly reports. After dinner, Carrie excused herself to work on homework, leaving Daniel and Gabrielle alone with the dishes and the weight of everything they hadn't said. They worked in comfortable silence, falling into the same easy rhythm they'd shared years ago, he washing, she drying, their bodies moving around each other in the small kitchen with unconscious familiarity. "She's incredible," Daniel said finally, his voice soft with wonder. "Brilliant, curious, kind. You've done an amazing job raising her." "I've done my best," Gabrielle replied, but there was a tremor in her voice that made Daniel look at her more closely. "Some days I wonder if my best is enough." "What do you mean?" Gabrielle set down the dish towel and turned to face him, her expression vulnerable in a way that made his chest tight. "She asks about her father sometimes. About why he's not here, whether he knows about her, whether he would love her if he did. I tell her that her father is a good man with important work, but how do I explain that sometimes love isn't enough to make someone stay?" The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Here was the conversation they'd been dancing around since yesterday, the truth that had been building between them with every shared glance and every moment of recognition. "Gabrielle," he said carefully, "how old is Carrie?" 8, she replied, not meeting his eyes. "She'll be 9 in November." Daniel's hand stilled on the dish he was holding. November. 9 years ago, he and Gabrielle had been together until late September, when his father's illness had worsened and the pressure to secure the company's future had intensified. If Carrie was born in November. "The timing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Gabrielle replied, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "I know what you're thinking, and I know what you're wondering, and I know this is complicated and messy and not what either of us planned. Is she mine?" The question escaped before Daniel could stop it, raw and desperate and full of 9 years of not knowing what he'd lost. Gabrielle looked at him then, really looked at him, and Daniel saw his answer in her eyes before she spoke. "She's ours," she whispered. "She's always been ours." The dish slipped from Daniel's nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor in a shower of ceramic pieces that seemed to echo the sound of his world restructuring itself around this impossible, wonderful, terrifying truth. Carrie, brilliant, curious, kind Carrie, was his daughter. Their daughter. The child he'd never known he'd wanted was the child he'd unknowingly lost, and she'd been growing up just miles away from his empty penthouse, asking questions about a father who'd never known she existed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel's voice broke on the question. 9 years, Gabrielle. 9 years of her life that I missed. Because you chose the company, Gabrielle said, tears streaming down her face now. Because you chose duty over love, and I couldn't bear to make you choose again. I couldn't bear to watch you resent her for complicating your perfect corporate life. I would never have resented her, Daniel said fiercely, moving toward Gabrielle without conscious thought. Never. She's everything. She's perfect. She is, Gabrielle agreed, her voice thick with emotion. She's the best parts of both of us, and she's been the center of my world since the day she was born. But Daniel, you have to understand, I was 24 and alone and terrified. I didn't know how to tell you that choosing your father's legacy meant abandoning your own daughter. Daniel reached for her then, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry, Gabrielle. For leaving you alone, for missing her childhood, for being too much of a coward to fight for what mattered most. She doesn't know, Gabrielle said quickly. About you, I mean. She knows she has a father, but she doesn't know who he is. I thought it was kinder that way. What do we do now? Daniel asked, his thumbs brushing away her tears. How do we navigate this? How do I become the father she deserves without disrupting the life you've built? Before Gabrielle could answer, they heard Carrie's voice from the hallway, Mama? I heard something break. Is everything okay? They sprang apart like guilty teenagers, both wiping their eyes and trying to compose themselves. Daniel quickly knelt to clean up the broken dish while Gabrielle smoothed her hair and attempted to erase the evidence of their emotional conversation. Everything's fine, sweetheart, Gabrielle called back. Just a little accident. We'll be right there. But as Daniel disposed of the ceramic pieces and Gabrielle straightened her clothes, they both knew that nothing would ever be fine in the same way again. The truth was out now, complicated and messy and beautiful, and somehow they would have to figure out how to build a family from the pieces of the life they'd never had the courage to choose 9 years ago. The revelation had changed everything. Now the real work would begin. Chapter 5. The next 2 weeks passed in a surreal blur of stolen moments and careful boundaries. Daniel found himself making daily visits to the clinic, ostensibly to oversee the equipment installation but really just to be near Gabrielle and Carrie. He'd never experienced anything like the fierce protectiveness that surged through him every time he watched his daughter, their daughter, interact with patients, help with filing, or simply exist in the world with her bright curiosity and generous heart. But the secret was eating him alive. Every time Carrie smiled at him with those familiar steel-gray eyes, every time she asked innocent questions about his work or his life, every time she unconsciously mirrored his gestures or expressions, Daniel felt the weight of unspoken truth pressing against his chest like a physical force. How did you tell an 8-year-old that the man she'd been politely calling Mr. Park was actually her father? How did you explain 9 years of absence without destroying her faith in love itself? The corporate world, meanwhile, was growing increasingly suspicious of his frequent absences. Brad Quinn, the ambitious pharmaceutical executive who'd been Daniel's main rival for the CEO position years ago, had started asking pointed questions about Daniel's sudden interest in community outreach. The board meeting scheduled for today would be particularly challenging, as they were expected to finalize the merger with Maria's family company, a merger that would secure Park Pharmaceutical's position as the largest drug development conglomerate on the East Coast. Daniel sat in his office that morning, staring at the merger document spread across his mahogany desk, and felt nothing but emptiness. 6 months ago, this deal would have represented the pinnacle of his career. Now, all he could think about was how Carrie's face had lit up yesterday when she'd successfully explained molecular bonding to a group of younger children at the clinic. Success, he was learning, had nothing to do with quarterly profits and everything to do with the people who mattered most. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria, excited about today's board meeting. After the merger is approved, we should discuss moving our engagement announcement to next week. The timing will be perfect for the media cycle. Daniel stared at the message, his stomach churning. Maria. Beautiful, ambitious, perfectly appropriate Maria, who still believed she was marrying Chicago's most eligible pharmaceutical CEO. Maria, who had no idea that her fiancé had discovered he had a daughter and was falling in love all over again with the woman who'd raised her. Before he could respond to the text, his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Park? Ms. Deline is here to see you. She says it's urgent." Daniel's blood ran cold. Maria never made unannounced visits to his office. She was far too strategic for spontaneous gestures. "Send her in." Maria swept into his office with the controlled elegance of someone who'd been raised for exactly this kind of moment. She was wearing a tailored designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Darling," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." "About what?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew. "About your fascinating new hobby." Maria's voice was honey-sweet with an undercurrent of steel. "Your sudden devotion to community health initiatives. Your frequent visits to that charming little clinic in Riverside." Daniel's defenses went up immediately. Park Pharmaceuticals has always supported community health programs. "Of course," Maria agreed smoothly. "But you've never personally overseen equipment installations before. You've never spent entire afternoons playing with patients' children. You've never looked at community health directors the way you've been looking at Gabrielle Idris." The use of Gabrielle's full name sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, darling. I'm stating facts." Maria opened her purse and withdrew a manila envelope. "Facts that were quite easy to gather, once I knew where to look." She spread photographs across his desk with the methodical precision of someone playing a winning hand. Daniel and Gabrielle working together during the storm. Daniel helping elderly patients to their cars. Daniel kneeling beside Carrie in the clinic's children's area, both of them laughing at something she'd said. "Touching," Maria commented, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Really quite heartwarming. A successful CEO reconnecting with his former assistant. Very noble of you to help the less fortunate. Get to the point, Maria. The point is that your little charity work is about to become very expensive." Maria's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "You see, I also have photographs of the child. Carrie, isn't it? Fascinating little girl. She has your eyes, Daniel. Your exact eyes." Daniel's blood turned to ice. "You stay away from her." "Or what?" Maria's smile was razor-sharp. "You'll throw away everything you've built for a woman who was never good enough for you in the first place? You'll abandon your responsibilities to the company, to the board, to me, for some fantasy of domestic bliss?" "That's enough," Daniel said, his voice dangerously low. "No, darling, it's not nearly enough." Maria leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "Because you see, I've done more than just take photographs. I've done research. Birth certificates, hospital records, employment timelines. It's amazing what money can uncover when you know the right people to ask." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "What do you want?" "I want you to remember who you are," Maria said, her voice softening into something that might have been genuine hurt if Daniel hadn't known better. "I want you to remember that we've planned this merger for 2 years. That our families have been preparing for this alliance. That you have obligations that extend far beyond your personal desires. And if I refuse?" Maria's smile returned, colder than before. "Then I'll make sure everyone knows about your illegitimate daughter. The media will have a field day, Chicago's youngest pharmaceutical CEO, the man who's been publicly advocating for family values, secretly fathering children with his assistant. Your reputation will be destroyed. The company's stock will plummet. And that precious little clinic you've been funding? Well, I'm sure they'll understand when Park Pharmaceuticals suddenly can't afford to support community outreach programs anymore. The threat hung in the air like poison. Daniel stared at the photographs scattered across his desk, images of the happiness he'd just begun to rediscover, now weaponized against him. Maria had found his weakness and was prepared to exploit it with surgical precision. "You're threatening my daughter," Daniel said quietly. "I'm protecting our future," Maria corrected. "The board meeting is in 2 hours. The merger will be approved. Our engagement will be announced next week. And you will stop visiting that clinic immediately. And if I don't? Then you'll lose everything that matters to you. Your company, your reputation, your ability to provide for that child you suddenly care so much about. Choose wisely, Daniel. You can have your corporate empire, or you can have your little family fantasy. But you cannot have both." With that, Maria gathered her photographs and swept out of his office, leaving Daniel alone with the weight of an impossible choice. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the city sprawling below him, his kingdom, his legacy, the empire he'd built by sacrificing everything that truly mattered.
2 hours later, Daniel sat in the boardroom, surrounded by the men and women who controlled the fate of Park Pharmaceuticals. The merger documents were spread across the polished conference table, and Brad Quinn was making his final presentation about the strategic advantages of the alliance. "This merger represents the future of pharmaceutical innovation," Brad was saying, his voice filled with the kind of enthusiasm that Daniel had once shared.
"Combined resources, expanded research capabilities, unprecedented market reach. It's everything we've been working toward." Daniel nodded at the appropriate moments, signed the papers placed in front of him, and answered questions about quarterly projections and staffing transitions. But his mind was miles away, in a modest clinic where a little girl was probably helping elderly patients and asking questions about molecular structures. His phone buzzed with a text from Gabrielle. "Carrie's school is having a science fair next week. She's been working on a project about pharmaceutical chemistry and she's so excited to show you. Would you like to come?" Daniel stared at the message, his chest tight with longing and fear. This was what Maria was threatening to destroy, not just his relationship with Gabrielle, but his chance to be a real father to Carrie. His chance to watch her grow up, to be there for school plays and science fairs and all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that made up a life. "Daniel?" The board chairman's voice cut through his reverie. "Are you ready to sign the final merger documents?" Daniel looked around the table at the faces of people who'd shaped his career, people who'd supported his rise to power, people who expected him to choose the company over everything else, just as his father had done. Just as he'd done 9 years ago when he'd let Gabrielle walk away. But this time, there was more at stake than just his own happiness. This time, there was Carrie. "I need a moment," Daniel said, standing abruptly from the table. "Excuse me." He walked out of the boardroom, leaving 20 shocked executives behind, and found himself in the hallway where Gabrielle had walked away from him 9 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. Once again, he was facing a choice between duty and desire, between the expectations of others and the calling of his heart. This time, he knew what he had to choose. The question was whether he was brave enough to face the consequences. His phone rang, and Michelle Garner's name appeared on the screen. Gabrielle's best friend rarely called him directly, so Daniel answered immediately. "Daniel, thank God," Michelle's voice was tense with worry. "I'm at the clinic. There's been an incident. Maria Deline showed up here an hour ago with some kind of investigator. She was asking questions about Carrie, about her birth certificate, about her father. She upset some of the patients and made Gabrielle cry." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Where are they now?" "Gone, but Daniel, Carrie heard everything. She knows something's wrong. She's asking questions about why the pretty lady was interested in her daddy, why Mama was crying, why everyone suddenly got so quiet when she walked into the room. Can you feel the walls closing in around our star-crossed lovers? Life has a way of testing true love just when it's beginning to bloom again. If you're as invested in Daniel and Gabrielle's story as I am, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing in the comments. When life threw obstacles at your love story, how did you fight for what mattered most? Your experiences give hope to hearts everywhere. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 9 years of consequences crashing down around him. Maria's threats weren't just about his reputation or his company, they were about his daughter's emotional well-being, Gabrielle's peace of mind, and the fragile trust they'd been rebuilding one careful step at a time. "I'm coming," Daniel said, already heading for the elevator. "Tell Gabrielle I'm coming, and Michelle? Don't let anyone else near Carrie until I get there." As the elevator doors closed, Daniel caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished metal, a man in an expensive suit, heading away from a boardroom full of people who expected him to choose profit over family, status over love, duty over the most important decision of his life. This time, he was going to choose differently. This time, he was going to fight for what mattered most, even if it cost him everything else. The merger could wait. The board could wait. His entire corporate empire could wait. His family needed him now. Chapter 6. Daniel's Mercedes cut through Chicago traffic with the urgency of a man racing against time itself. Every red light felt like an eternity, every slow-moving car an obstacle between him and the family he'd only just discovered he couldn't live without. His phone rang incessantly, the board chairman, Brad Quinn, his assistant, all demanding to know where he'd gone and when he'd returned to sign the merger documents. Daniel ignored them all. The only voice that mattered was Michelle's, calling with updates. Gabrielle's in her office with the door closed. "She's trying to hold it together, but Daniel, I've never seen her this shaken. And Carrie keeps asking questions about the pretty lady and why everyone's acting strange." When Daniel finally arrived at the clinic, he found it in a state of controlled chaos. Staff members were moving with the careful efficiency of people trying to maintain normalcy in the face of upheaval. Patients in the waiting room exchanged worried glances and whispered conversations. The warm, healing atmosphere that had drawn Daniel back day after day felt fractured, contaminated by Maria's calculated cruelty. "Mr. Park." Jenny, the receptionist, looked up from her desk with obvious relief. "Thank goodness you're here. Ms. Idris is in her office, and Carrie is in the children's area with Mrs. Rodriguez. She's been asking for you." Daniel's heart clenched. Of course Carrie would be asking for him. In her innocent mind, he was the safe adult who helped with science projects and listened to her stories. She had no idea that his very presence in their lives had brought this danger to their doorstep. He found Carrie in the pediatric area, sitting quietly with her coloring book while Mrs. Rodriguez kept gentle watch. The moment she saw him, her face brightened with relief that made Daniel's chest ache. "Mr. Park. You came." Carrie jumped up and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist with the trust of a child who'd never had reason to doubt that the adults in her life would protect her. "There was a pretty lady here earlier, and she was asking about my daddy, and Mama got really upset, and nobody will tell me what's wrong." Daniel knelt down to her level, his hands automatically coming up to smooth her dark curls, a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. Looking into her steel-gray eyes, seeing his own features reflected in her innocent face, he felt the full weight of what he'd been denying himself for 9 years. "I know this is confusing, sweetheart," he said gently. "Why don't you stay here with Mrs. Rodriguez for a few more minutes while I talk to your mama? Then we'll all sit down together and figure this out, okay? Promise?" Carrie's voice was small, vulnerable in a way that made Daniel's protective instincts surge to life. "Promise," Daniel said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Whatever happened next, whatever it cost him, he would not let this child down again. He found Gabrielle in her office, sitting behind her desk with her head in her hands. She looked up when he entered, and Daniel saw that her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, not the elegant, strategic tears that Maria employed like weapons, but the raw, genuine grief of someone whose world had just been threatened. "Daniel," she said, her voice hoarse. "You shouldn't be here. She'll make good on her threats. She'll destroy everything you've built." "Let her try," Daniel said, closing the door behind him and moving to kneel beside her chair. "Gabrielle, look at me. Please." When she finally met his eyes, Daniel saw fear there, not for herself, but for Carrie. For the child who'd been asking innocent questions about her father for years, only to have that innocence shattered by a woman who saw love as weakness and family as leverage. "Tell me exactly what happened," Daniel said, taking her hands in his. "Every detail." Gabrielle took a shaky breath and began to speak. She came in around noon, dressed like she was going to a board meeting. She had this investigator with her, a man with a camera who kept taking pictures of everything. She asked Jenny about clinic operations, about funding, about how long I'd been here. All very professional, very polite. And then? Then she started asking about Carrie. About when she was born, about her father, about why she spent so much time at the clinic. The investigator took pictures of her playing with the other children, of her artwork on the walls. "And Daniel, the way she looked at our daughter." Gabrielle's voice broke. Like she was a problem to be solved rather than a little girl who deserves to be protected. Daniel's jaw clenched. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing. I said Carrie's father was a private matter and asked them to leave. But she just smiled and said she already had all the information she needed. She said that some secrets had a way of coming out whether we wanted them to or not." "And Carrie heard?" "She came back from helping in the pharmacy just as Maria was leaving. She heard Maria tell her investigator that the resemblance was unmistakable and that the timeline would be easy to prove. Then she heard me crying in the supply closet afterward." Gabrielle's hands tightened in his. "Daniel, she's 8 years old. She doesn't understand why strange adults are suddenly interested in her father, why everyone's acting scared, why her mama is crying." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 9 years of consequences crashing down around them. Every choice he'd made, every moment of cowardice, had led to this, his daughter confused and frightened, the woman he loved threatened and vulnerable, their fragile new beginning poisoned by his past mistakes. "There's something else," Gabrielle said quietly. "Kevin came by this afternoon. He'd heard about Maria's visit through the clinic's gossip network. He asked me point blank if you were Carrie's father." Daniel's blood ran cold. Kevin Jones. Kind, stable Kevin, who'd been a father figure to Carrie for years, who'd proposed marriage and been gently turned down without understanding why. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. I couldn't lie to him anymore, Daniel. He's been so patient, so good to both of us. He deserved to know why I could never love him the way he loved me." Tears began flowing down Gabrielle's cheeks again. "He took it better than I expected. He said he'd always known there was someone else, someone who'd left a mark on my heart that no one else could erase. But he also said he couldn't stand by and watch Carrie get hurt in whatever battle was coming." "He's not wrong," Daniel said grimly. "Maria won't stop here. She'll escalate until she gets what she wants." "Then maybe you should give it to her," Gabrielle said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you should marry her, complete your merger, and stay away from us. Carrie and I have survived 9 years without you. We can survive the rest." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter anymore," Gabrielle replied, but her hands were still clinging to his. "What matters is keeping Carrie safe. What matters is making sure she doesn't become collateral damage in a war between your past and your future." "She's not collateral damage," Daniel said fiercely. "She's my daughter. Our daughter. And I'll be damned if I let Maria Deline or anyone else use her as a pawn in their games. Before Gabrielle could respond, a soft knock interrupted them. Michelle Garner peered around the door, her expression apologetic but urgent. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation. Carrie's asking very specific questions about why the pretty lady was interested in her daddy, and Mrs. Rodriguez thinks she's starting to piece things together. Kids are a lot smarter than we give them credit for, especially when it comes to adult secrets. Daniel and Gabrielle exchanged a look of mutual understanding. They'd run out of time. The conversation they'd been dreading, the revelation that would change everything, could no longer be avoided. Bring her in, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. It's time she knew the truth. Michelle nodded and disappeared. A moment later, Carrie appeared in the doorway, her small face serious with the weight of questions she was too young to have to ask. Mama? Mr. Park? Are you both okay? Everyone's been acting really weird today. Daniel looked at Gabrielle, saw his own terror and determination reflected in her dark eyes, and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Come here, sweetheart, he said, moving to the small couch in Gabrielle's office. We need to talk. Carrie settled between them, her small hands automatically reaching for both of theirs in a gesture of trust that made Daniel's heart break and soar simultaneously. Here was his daughter, brilliant, intuitive, brave, preparing to learn a truth that would redefine her understanding of herself and her place in the world. Carrie, Gabrielle began, her voice gentle but firm, do you remember how we've talked about your father? About how he's a good man who had important work to do. Yes, Carrie said, her gray eyes, Daniel's eyes, moving between them with growing understanding. You said he loved me but couldn't be with us. That's right. And honey, the reason he couldn't be with us was because he didn't know about you. I never told him that you existed. Carrie's brow furrowed in the way that made her look exactly like Daniel when he was concentrating. But why didn't you tell him? Don't daddies want to know about their little girls? Most daddies do, Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. And your daddy would have wanted to know about you more than anything in the world. But sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes they're too scared to do the right thing. What kind of mistakes? Carrie asked, her innocent question cutting straight to the heart of everything Daniel had been trying to understand about his own choices. The kind where you think you have to choose between loving someone and doing what other people expect of you, Daniel explained. The kind where you're so afraid of making the wrong choice that you don't make any choice at all. Carrie studied his face with the intensity of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions with startling accuracy. Mr. Park, she said slowly, are you my daddy? The question hung in the air like a bridge between the past and the future, between the man Daniel had been and the father he desperately wanted to become. Gabrielle's hand tightened in his, and Daniel felt the weight of 9 years of silence pressing against his chest. Yes, he said simply, his voice breaking on the word. I'm your daddy, Carrie. I'm your daddy, and I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. For a moment, the office was completely silent except for the sound of 3 people breathing. Then Carrie launched herself into Daniel's arms with the wholehearted trust of childhood, and Daniel held her against his chest while tears streamed down his face. I knew it, she whispered against his shoulder. I knew you felt like my daddy. You have the same eyes as me, and you explain science the way I think about it, and you make Mama happy in a way that makes her look like she's glowing. Daniel looked over Carrie's head at Gabrielle, who was crying and smiling simultaneously. She's been asking about you for months, Gabrielle said softly. Every time you visited the clinic, she'd say there was something familiar about you. I should have told you sooner, Daniel said, his voice muffled against Carrie's curls. I should have been here for your whole life. I should have been the father you deserved from the beginning. You're here now, Carrie said with the simple wisdom of childhood. That's what matters. You're here now, and you're going to stay, right? You're not going to leave like you did before? The question was innocent, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of wondering, of bedtime stories that ended with questions about absent fathers, of looking at other children with their daddies and wondering what was wrong with her that hers couldn't stay. "I'm never leaving you again," Daniel said, the words coming from the deepest part of his soul. "Never, sweetheart. I promise you that." "But what about the pretty lady?" Carrie asked, pulling back to look at him with concern. "She seemed really angry about something. And she kept taking pictures of me and asking about my daddy." Daniel's expression hardened. "The pretty lady is someone who doesn't understand that some things are more important than business. But you don't have to worry about her anymore, okay? Daddy's going to take care of everything." "How?" Carrie asked with the direct curiosity that made her such an extraordinary child. Daniel looked at Gabrielle, then back at his daughter, their daughter, and felt something settle in his chest. The fear was still there, and the uncertainty about what came next, but underneath it all was a bedrock certainty that he'd never experienced in any boardroom or corporate negotiation. "By choosing what matters most," he said simply. "By choosing you and Mama over everything else." As if summoned by his words, Daniel's phone began ringing insistently. The board chairman's name appeared on the screen, followed immediately by text messages from Brad Quinn, from his assistant, from Maria herself. Daniel looked at the phone, then at his daughter's trusting face, then at Gabrielle's hopeful expression. Without hesitation, he turned the phone off and set it aside. "But won't you get in trouble?" Carrie asked, her forehead creased with worry. "Won't your boss be mad?" Daniel smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. "I don't have a boss, sweetheart. And even if I did, nothing is more important than being your daddy." The truth was out now, beautiful and terrifying and irreversible. Whatever came next, Maria's threats, the board's reaction, the corporate consequences of his choice, Daniel would face it as a father first and a CEO second. For the first time in 9 years, he had his priorities exactly right. Chapter 7. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows storms, both meteorological and emotional. Daniel woke up in his penthouse apartment, but for the first time in 9 years, the sterile luxury felt like a prison rather than a sanctuary. The floor-to-ceiling windows that once made him feel master of his domain now seemed to separate him from the real world where his daughter was probably eating breakfast and asking Gabrielle 1,000 questions about having a daddy. His phone had been buzzing incessantly since he'd turned it back on at 6 a.m. 27 missed calls from board members, 14 from Maria, 6 from his assistant, and 1 from Ralph Woods, the only one he actually wanted to return. "Daniel," Ralph's voice was warm but concerned when he answered. "I heard about yesterday's board meeting. Or rather, I heard about your dramatic exit from yesterday's board meeting." "News travels fast," Daniel said, loosening his tie as he stared out at the city below. In the pharmaceutical world, when a CEO walks out on a billion-dollar merger signing, it tends to generate conversation. "Brad Quinn is calling for an emergency board meeting to discuss your fitness for leadership. Maria Deline is threatening to sue for breach of contract. And there are rumors that you've been keeping some very interesting secrets." Daniel's stomach clenched. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that suggest you have a daughter you've never mentioned to anyone." Ralph's voice was carefully neutral. "The kind that suggests this daughter might be the reason you've been spending so much time at a certain community health clinic." For a moment, Daniel considered denying it, falling back on the corporate instinct to control information and manage perceptions. Then he thought of Carrie's trusting face, of the way she'd called him Daddy, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and felt something settle in his chest. "Her name is Carrie," Daniel said quietly. "She's 8 years old. She wants to be a doctor, and she's the most extraordinary person I've ever met. And yes, Ralph, she's the reason I've been reevaluating everything I thought I knew about success." Ralph was quiet for a long moment. "Does she know you're her father?" "As of yesterday, yes. And Ralph, I've never felt anything like it. Holding her, hearing her call me daddy, seeing her eyes light up when she realized I wasn't going anywhere, it was like being born again. And her mother? Gabrielle Idris. You remember her, she was my assistant 9 years ago. She's been raising Carrie alone, and she's done an incredible job. She's turned that clinic into something magical, Ralph. It's everything our company should be, healing-focused, community-centered, genuinely committed to making people's lives better. I see. Ralph's voice carried a note of something that might have been pride. And now you're facing a choice between your corporate responsibilities and your family. No, Daniel said firmly. I've already made my choice. Yesterday, when I walked out of that boardroom, I chose my family. The question now is how to protect them from the consequences of that choice. What do you mean? Daniel explained Maria's threats, her investigation, her willingness to use Carrie as leverage to force him back into line. With each detail, Ralph's breathing grew heavier, and Daniel could practically hear the older man's blood pressure rising. That manipulative little, Ralph caught himself. Daniel, you know I've never been fond of Maria Deline, but this crosses every line. Using a child as leverage? Threatening to destroy a community health clinic? This isn't business anymore, this is personal vengeance. She's calling for a press conference this afternoon, Daniel said grimly. She's going to announce that our engagement is off due to my personal indiscretions and that the merger is dead because I'm too emotionally compromised to run the company effectively. Let her, Ralph said, his voice carrying a steel Daniel had rarely heard. Let her call her press conference. But Daniel, I want you to call one too. It's time to stop letting other people control the narrative of your life. What do you mean? I mean it's time to tell your story. The real story. Not the sanitized corporate version that the board wants to hear, but the truth about a man who walked away from love once and isn't going to make that mistake again. Before Daniel could respond, his building's concierge called to announce that he had visitors. Daniel's pulse quickened. Had Maria decided to escalate her threats? Had the board sent someone to demand his immediate return? Send them up, he said, then returned to Ralph. I have to go. But Ralph, whatever happens today, I want you to know that you've been more of a father to me than, save it for after the battle, son, Ralph interrupted gently. Go take care of your family. I'll handle the corporate vultures. Daniel's visitors turned out to be Gabrielle and Carrie, both looking nervous but determined. Carrie was wearing a yellow dress that made her look like captured sunshine, and she was carrying a small wrapped package that she clutched with both hands. I hope we're not interrupting, Gabrielle said, her eyes taking in the opulent penthouse with something that might have been sadness. Carrie had something she wanted to give you, and I thought. Well, I thought you should know what's happening. What's happening? Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew. Maria Deline called the clinic this morning, Gabrielle said, her voice tight with controlled anger. She spoke to Jenny, told her that the clinic's funding was being re-evaluated due to concerns about my professional judgment. She said that Park Pharmaceuticals would be conducting a full audit of our operations and that any irregularities would result in immediate termination of support. Daniel's jaw clenched. She's trying to force me back into line by threatening your livelihood. It's worse than that, Gabrielle continued. She's also contacted the state licensing board. She's filed a complaint suggesting that I've been using my position to pursue an inappropriate relationship with a major donor. She's questioning my fitness to run the clinic. She can't do that, Daniel said, his voice dangerous. She has no evidence of any wrongdoing. She doesn't need evidence, Gabrielle replied sadly. She just needs doubt. And Daniel, I can't fight her. I don't have the resources, the connections, the legal team. If she destroys my reputation, Carrie and I will have to leave Chicago. We'll have to start over somewhere else. No, Daniel said firmly. That's not happening. I won't let her destroy your life because of me. But what can you do? Gabrielle asked. If you fight her, she'll destroy you too. She'll make sure everyone knows about Carrie, about us, about everything. Your company, your reputation, everything you've built, Daddy, Carrie interrupted quietly, and the simple words stopped both adults mid-sentence. She'd been standing patiently while they talked, but now she stepped forward with the grave seriousness of a child who'd been thinking hard about grown-up problems. Yes, sweetheart. I made you something, she said, holding out the wrapped package. I know everything's really complicated right now, and I know the pretty lady is trying to make trouble for you and Mama. But I wanted you to have this so you'd remember that some things are more important than being scared. Daniel knelt down to her level and carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a hand-drawn picture of 3 people standing in front of a building labeled, Clinic. The figures were clearly meant to be him, Gabrielle, and Carrie, all holding hands and smiling. At the bottom, in Carrie's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "My family." It's beautiful, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I drew it yesterday after you told me you were my daddy, Carrie said. I wanted to show you what I've been dreaming about my whole life. A family where everyone stays together and takes care of each other. Daniel looked at the drawing, then at his daughter's hopeful face, then at Gabrielle's worried expression. In that moment, he felt something crystallize in his chest, not just love, but purpose. Not just desire, but destiny. Carrie, he said carefully, what if I told you that I could make this picture come true? That I could make sure we're all together, and that Mama never has to worry about the clinic, and that the pretty lady can't hurt any of us anymore? How? Carrie asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. By being brave, Daniel said simply. By telling everyone the truth and not being ashamed of it. By choosing our family over everything else, even when it's scary. He stood and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Janet? It's Daniel. I need you to set up a press conference for this afternoon. 1 o'clock, at the clinic. And Janet? Make sure every major media outlet in Chicago is there. This is going to be the most important announcement of my career. Daniel, what are you doing? Gabrielle asked, her voice tight with anxiety. I'm going to tell our story, Daniel said, his voice filled with a confidence he'd never felt in any boardroom. I'm going to tell everyone about the brilliant woman who transformed a struggling clinic into something extraordinary. I'm going to tell them about the daughter who's taught me more about success in 2 weeks than I learned in 9 years of corporate climbing. And I'm going to tell them that Park Pharmaceuticals is changing direction. That we're going to focus on healing communities, not just generating profits. But the board, Gabrielle began. The board will adapt or find a new CEO, Daniel said firmly. And Maria can make all the threats she wants. The truth is more powerful than her manipulations. 2 hours later, Daniel stood in the clinic's main waiting area, facing a room full of reporters, cameras, and community members who'd heard that something important was happening. Maria sat in the front row, her face a mask of controlled fury, while Brad Quinn lurked near the back with several other board members who'd clearly come to witness what they expected to be Daniel's professional suicide. But Daniel wasn't looking at any of them. His eyes were fixed on Gabrielle and Carrie, who were standing near the reception desk, holding hands and watching him with a mixture of love and terror. Thank you all for coming, Daniel began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. I called this press conference because it's time to tell the truth about Park Pharmaceuticals, about community health care, and about what really matters in life. He paused, took a breath, and stepped off the corporate cliff he'd been standing on for 9 years. 9 years ago, I made a choice that I've regretted every day since. I chose duty over love, expectations over authenticity, and corporate success over personal happiness. I let the most important person in my life walk away because I was too afraid to fight for what mattered most. Maria's eyes narrowed, but Daniel kept talking. That person was Gabrielle Idris, who was my assistant and is now the director of this incredible clinic. She's also the mother of my daughter, Carrie, who I'm publicly acknowledging for the first time today. The room erupted in camera flashes and whispered conversations, but Daniel pressed on. I'm not here to make excuses or to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to announce that Park Pharmaceuticals is changing direction. We're going to focus on community health initiatives, on making medicine accessible to everyone who needs it, on healing communities instead of just generating profits for shareholders. Mr. Park, a reporter called out, are you saying you're abandoning your corporate responsibilities for personal reasons? Daniel smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in a press conference in years. I'm saying I'm finally understanding what responsibility actually means. It means being accountable to the people who matter most. It means using your resources to heal rather than harm. It means choosing love over fear, even when it's terrifying. He looked directly at Maria, whose face had gone pale with rage. There are people in this city who believe that love is weakness, that family is a distraction, that the only success worth having is the kind that shows up on quarterly reports. I used to be one of those people. But I've learned that true success is measured by the lives you touch, the communities you heal, and the courage you show in choosing authenticity over expectation. What about your engagement to Maria Deline? Another reporter asked. Ms. Deline and I have different visions for what pharmaceutical companies should prioritize, Daniel said diplomatically. I wish her well, but I'm choosing a different path. Maria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You're making a mistake, Daniel, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. You're throwing away everything you've built for a fantasy that won't last. No, Daniel said quietly, his eyes finding Gabrielle and Carrie again. I'm finally building something worth keeping. Maria swept out of the room, followed by several board members who were clearly reconsidering their support. But Daniel barely noticed. He was too focused on the way Carrie was beaming at him, on the tears of pride streaming down Gabrielle's face, on the feeling of finally being exactly where he belonged. Mr. Park, a reporter called out, what's your message to other executives who might be struggling with similar choices? Daniel thought for a moment, then smiled. Choose love, he said simply. Choose the people who matter most. Choose authenticity over expectation. And remember that the most important legacy you can leave isn't in a boardroom or a quarterly report, it's in the hearts of the people you love. As the press conference ended and reporters rushed to file their stories, Daniel walked over to Gabrielle and Carrie. Without hesitation, he pulled them both into his arms, holding them close while cameras flashed and the world watched. Are you sure about this? Gabrielle whispered against his chest. Are you sure this is what you want? I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Daniel replied, his voice filled with a peace he'd never experienced. This is what I want. This is what I choose. This is who I am. And for the first time in 9 years, Daniel Park felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Chapter 8. 6 months later, the Riverside Community Health Center buzzed with the kind of vibrant energy that comes from dreams finally becoming reality. The grand reopening celebration was in full swing, with patients, staff, community members, and local dignitaries gathered to witness the transformation of what had once been a struggling clinic into the flagship of Park Pharmaceutical's revolutionary community health initiative. Daniel Park stood near the newly installed children's play area, watching Carrie demonstrate the interactive health education displays to a group of fascinated younger children. She moved with the confident grace of someone who'd found her purpose early, explaining complex medical concepts with the same patient enthusiasm he'd discovered in himself over the past months. She's going to be an extraordinary doctor, said Dr. Michelle Garner, who'd recently been promoted to assistant medical director. But then again, she's got extraordinary parents. Daniel smiled, still getting used to the easy way people now spoke about his role in Carrie's life. The media attention following his press conference had been intense but ultimately positive. The story of a pharmaceutical CEO choosing family over profit had resonated with people hungry for authentic leadership in corporate America. Speaking of extraordinary parents, Michelle continued with a knowing smile, "Have you seen the way Gabrielle's been glowing lately? I haven't seen her this happy since you came back into her life." Daniel's gaze found Gabrielle across the room, where she was addressing a group of city council members about the clinic's expansion plans. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes, and when she laughed at something Councilman Rodriguez said, the sound made Daniel's chest tight with the same overwhelming love he'd felt the first time he'd heard it 9 years ago. The transformation in all their lives had been remarkable. Park Pharmaceutical's stock had initially dropped following Daniel's dramatic announcement, but the company's new focus on community health initiatives had generated unprecedented positive publicity. Orders for their affordable medication programs had increased by 300%, and pharmaceutical companies across the country were scrambling to develop their own community outreach programs. Brad Quinn, who'd initially opposed Daniel's new direction, had become one of the program's strongest advocates after seeing the quarterly reports. Turns out, he'd admitted grudgingly, doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive after all. Even the board had come around, especially after Ralph Woods had presented a comprehensive analysis showing that community-focused pharmaceutical companies consistently outperformed their profit-only competitors in long-term sustainability and public trust. Maria Deline had attempted to follow through on her threats, but her vindictive approach had backfired spectacularly. The media had painted her as a bitter woman trying to destroy a father's relationship with his daughter, and her family's pharmaceutical company had quietly distanced themselves from her actions. She'd eventually withdrawn from the Chicago social scene entirely, relocating to New York where she could rebuild her reputation away from the wreckage of her failed manipulation. "Daddy!" Carrie's voice cut through Daniel's reverie as she bounded over with the limitless energy of childhood. "Come see the new laboratory equipment. Dr. Martinez is showing everyone how the machines can test for diseases super quickly." Daniel allowed himself to be pulled along, marveling at how natural it felt to be called "Daddy" by this remarkable little girl. The transition hadn't been without its challenges. Carrie had needed time to process having a father suddenly appear in her life, and Daniel had needed to learn how to be present for school events, bedtime stories, and the countless small moments that made up a child's world. But they'd figured it out together, with Gabrielle's patient guidance and Carrie's generous heart leading the way. Daniel had moved out of his sterile penthouse into a warm family home in Gabrielle's neighborhood, where children played in the yards and neighbors actually knew each other's names. He'd learned to cook Sunday pancakes, to help with homework, to read bedtime stories with the right voices for different characters. "This is incredible," Daniel said, genuinely impressed by the state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment that now filled the clinic's expanded laboratory. "We can run tests here that used to require sending samples to hospitals across the city." "That's the point," Gabrielle said, appearing beside them with the quiet pride of someone who'd seen her vision finally come to life. "No more waiting weeks for results. No more patients having to choose between medications and groceries. Just healing, available to everyone who needs it." As the evening progressed, Daniel found himself in the clinic's community garden, where string lights cast a warm glow over the vegetables and flowers that patients and staff had planted together. The garden had become a symbol of the clinic's philosophy, that healing happened best in communities, that growth required both individual effort and collective support. "You know," Gabrielle said, joining him among the tomato plants, "I never imagined it would look like this. When I first started working here, I thought success meant just keeping the doors open another month. And now?" Daniel asked, moving closer to her in the intimate darkness. "Now I know that success means creating something that will outlast us. Something that will still be healing people long after we're gone." She looked up at him with eyes that held 9 years of growth and newfound hope. "Success means building a legacy with the people you love." Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, his heart racing with the same nervous energy he'd felt before his first board presentation. Speaking of building something that will outlast us. Gabrielle's breath caught as he dropped to one knee in the garden where their love had been reborn, where they'd learned to choose each other over fear. Gabrielle Idris, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, 9 years ago, I was too much of a coward to fight for us. I let duty and fear make my choices, and I lost the most important thing in my life. I won't make that mistake again. He opened the box to reveal a ring that caught the garden lights like captured starlight, not the massive diamond that corporate expectations would have demanded, but a simple, elegant band that spoke of authenticity over ostentation. I'm not asking you to marry the CEO of Park Pharmaceuticals, Daniel continued. I'm asking you to marry Daniel Park, the man who learned what love really means by watching you raise our daughter. The man who discovered that the greatest success isn't in conquering markets, it's in coming home to the people who matter most. Tears streamed down Gabrielle's face as she looked at the ring, then at Daniel's hopeful expression, then at the clinic glowing with warm light behind them. Are you sure? She whispered. Are you sure this is the life you want? Not the penthouse, not the corporate empire, not the society expectations? I've never been more sure of anything, Daniel replied. This is the life I want. This is the love I choose. This is the family I'm going to spend every day proving I deserve. Yes, Gabrielle said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Daniel. Yes to all of it. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Carrie's voice rang out from the clinic's back door, Mama. Daddy. Come quick. They're about to cut the cake. Daniel and Gabrielle looked at each other and burst into laughter, the kind of deep, genuine laughter that comes from joy so complete it can't be contained. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the clinic, toward the celebration, toward the community they'd built together. As I watch Daniel and Gabrielle's love story come full circle, I'm reminded that sometimes the greatest victories come from having the courage to return to what we thought we'd lost forever. Their journey shows us that it's never too late to choose love over fear, authenticity over expectation, and family over the hollow victories that leave our hearts empty. What would you do if you discovered that the love you thought was impossible was actually waiting for you to be brave enough to claim it? Have you ever had to choose between what was expected and what your heart knew was right? Share your stories in the comments. Your experiences inspire others to believe in love's power to transform everything. If Daniel and Gabrielle's journey touched your heart, make sure you're subscribed to Dear Love Diaries so you never miss these stories of love conquering all odds. Hit that notification bell because tomorrow, we'll explore another tale of hearts finding their way home against impossible circumstances. Show this story some love with a like if it reminded you that true love is worth fighting for, and don't forget to share your own second-chance love stories in the comments below. Your experiences create a community of hope for everyone who believes in love's power to heal and transform. Remember, dear hearts, sometimes the love we think we've lost forever is actually just waiting for us to become brave enough to claim it. The greatest legacy we can leave isn't in boardrooms or bank accounts, it's in the hearts of the people we choose to love without reservation. Daniel Park learned that choosing love over fear wasn't just about personal happiness, it was about creating a legacy of healing that would touch countless lives for generations to come. When we choose authenticity over expectation, when we choose family over profit, when we choose love over everything else, we don't just transform our own lives, we transform the world. Until tomorrow, keep believing in the power of love to rewrite any story, and remember that it's never too late to choose the life your heart knows you're meant to live.